Burnett County, Wisconsin, September 1893. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, carried the first crisp promise of the coming cold. Along the ridge overlooking the Yellow River, a man named Lars Hagström was doing something no one had ever seen before. He wasn't building a cabin. He was building a triangle. With his 14-year-old son, Sven, he wrestled a massive bark-stripped pine log into a vertical position. The log, one of 60 scavenged from the forest floor, was not meant for a wall. It was the wall. It was also the roof. It leaned inward at a steep, almost comical angle, meeting its opposite number at a sharp peak 22 feet above the ground. Down by the wagon trace, a group of men paused their work. Among them was Beecher Pinkston, the county forest crew's foreman, a man whose opinion on timber was as good as law. He squinted, his face a mask of professional disbelief. "What in God's name is the Swede doing now?" muttered Jebediah Stone, a farmer whose own cabin was a testament to the sturdy, four-square logic of the frontier. "Looks like he's building a woodshed for a giant." Pinkston spat a stream of tobacco juice. "He's building a coffin, is what he's doing. A tall one." He gestured with his thumb. "I told him last week when I saw him hauling that deadfall. That's windfall pine, most of it down for a season or two. Punky in the heartwood. It's got no live strength." He turned to the others, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The first wet snow we get, the kind that clings, it'll load up on that ridiculous pitch, the weight will bear down, and that ridgepole will come straight through the floor. He's putting his family to sleep under a deadfall trap." The men nodded, the assessment making perfect sense. You built with sound, standing timber. You built with 4 walls and a roof, not 2 walls that were a roof. You built low and solid to brace against the wind, not a tall, foolish peak that seemed to invite it. Lars and Sven, oblivious or indifferent, set the next log, their movements methodical. Lars sighted down the line, a quiet intensity in his posture. He'd heard the whispers, the outright mockery. He'd seen the gestures from men like Pinkston. They called him the Mad Swede of Burnett County, a fool building a foolish house. But what did this Swedish stuga byggar from the boreal forests of Värmland understand about convective rise and the physics of snowshed that the experienced practical timber men of Wisconsin had missed? The answer to that question would not be found in arguments or explanations. It would be written across the landscape in ice and snow, in survival and loss. It would prove that sometimes the straightest line to safety is not a flat wall, but a steep, audacious angle. I'm going to tell you the story of Lars Hagström's A-frame cabin. It's a story about the hidden wisdom of old-world knowledge and the brutal honesty of a Wisconsin winter. I promise that by the end, you will understand the simple, powerful physics that allowed one family to live in warmth and safety while their neighbors fought a losing battle against the cold. If you appreciate stories of ingenuity and resilience, consider subscribing to this channel and hitting the like button. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen to a common problem? Lars Hagström was not a farmer. He had no feel for the soil, no intuition for the seasons of planting and harvest. He was not a sawyer, though his hands were calloused from the axe and saw. He was a stuga bygger, a cabin builder from the deep woods of Värmland, Sweden. His knowledge was not of broad, flat fields, but of steep, forested hillsides buried under immense snows. His trade was not measured in bushels, but in the geometry of warmth. He had spent his youth working with the tall, straight pines of the Norland, learning the secrets of the kota, the traditional Sami dwelling, and the steep-roofed stuga that dotted the Lapland landscape. He understood the behavior of snow, not just as a blanket, but as a load, a force, a creeping weight that could crush a poorly designed structure. He understood that warmth did not like to be trapped in a box, it liked to climb. He had arrived in Wisconsin 2 years prior with his wife Ingrid and their 2 young children, Sven and Karen. They came with the promise of land and a new life, a promise that felt hollowed out by their first winter. They had purchased a standard frontier cabin, a simple 16 by 20 foot box of horizontal logs, chinked with mud and grass. It was built just as Beecher Pinkston would have advised, solid, low-slung, and orthodox. And it was a death trap of cold. That winter was a lesson taught in misery. Lars remembered the morning the iron stove poker, a thick rod of forged steel, broke at the hilt with a sharp crack when he struck it against the frozen stove lid to break the ice from the water reservoir. He remembered the sound of a cured mutton leg, taken from the pantry, shattering like glass, when Ingrid dropped it on the floorboards. The cold was not just an absence of heat. It was an active, invasive presence. It found every pinhole in the chinking, every gap around the doorframe. The family lived in a perpetual twilight, huddled around a stove that devoured wood at an astonishing rate, yet projected its heat only a few feet into the room. Beyond that small circle of warmth, the air was a physical enemy. Frost grew in intricate, fern-like patterns on the inside of the walls. Lars kept his ammunition in a wooden box by the hearth, and when he opened it one morning, he saw that every brass cartridge head wore a perfect, tiny ring of frost, a miniature crown of cold. Ingrid's face, usually so full of life, grew pinched and pale. The children were always sick, their coughs echoing in the frigid air. They slept in their coats, under every blanket they owned, and still woke shivering. Lars, a man who had built shelters to withstand the Arctic winds of northern Sweden, felt a deep, burning shame. His family was suffering because he had trusted the local wisdom, a wisdom that was clearly failing. The conventional cabin was a sieve, leaking heat at 1,000 points. It fought the cold with brute force, by burning more and more fuel, but it was a losing battle. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem wasn't the wood. The problem was the box itself. As spring thawed the frozen landscape, Lars walked the woods, not as a farmer looking for arable land, but as a builder looking for a solution. His mind went back to the forms he knew, the steep gabled structures of his homeland. He saw how they shed the heavy, wet snows of the north, how their tall interiors allowed the precious heat from a central hearth to rise and collect in the sleeping lofts. The answer was not to build a better box. The answer was to abandon the box entirely. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was a failure of physics. The men who built them, capable and hardworking, understood timber and joinery. They did not, however, fully grasp the thermodynamics of their enemy. Their primary foe was not just low temperature, it was the combination of cold, wind, and moisture. A conventional cabin, with its 4 vertical walls and a low-pitched roof, presented a massive surface area to the elements. Every square foot of wall was a front in the war against heat loss. The logs themselves, even dense oak or pine, were not great insulators. Their R value, a measure of thermal resistance, was low. Heat conducted directly through the wood. But the real villain was air infiltration. The long, horizontal seams between logs, packed with chinking made of mud, clay, and grass, were the cabin's Achilles heel. As the logs settled and the seasons changed, the wood expanded and contracted. The chinking, brittle and inflexible, would crack and crumble. Tiny fissures would open up, invisible to the eye, but wide enough for cold air to knife through. On a windy day, the pressure differential between the windward and leeward sides of the cabin would turn these cracks into a system of air pumps. Cold air was actively forced into the living space, while warm air was sucked out. You could feel it as a constant nagging draft near the walls. A candle flame would flicker and dance, not from the movement of people in the room, but from the house's own leaky breathing. The low-pitched roof was an even greater liability, especially during a wet Wisconsin snow. A gentle slope, perhaps a 4-12 or 5-12 pitch, was easy to build, but it did not effectively shed snow. Light, fluffy powder might blow off, but the heavy, wet snow with a high moisture content would stick like plaster. As temperatures fluctuated, this snow would melt slightly and then refreeze, turning into a dense, icy layer. This layer did two disastrous things. First, it added an enormous weight to the roof structure, a constant, crushing load that could exceed 20 or 30 pounds per square foot. Timbers would groan, and in extreme cases collapse. Second, and more insidiously, this thick blanket of ice and snow acted as a cold sink. It held the temperature of the outside air directly against the roof sheathing. The minimal attic space, if one even existed, would become a pocket of Arctic air, drawing heat out of the living space below through the ceiling boards. The cabin was fighting a battle on 5 fronts, 4 walls and a roof, and losing on all of them. It was an architecture of brute resistance, not intelligent design. It required a constant, massive input of energy, endless cords of wood, just to maintain a small island of habitability in a sea of cold. This was the trap Lars Hagström and his family had endured, and the one he vowed he would never enter again. The construction of the A-frame began in late summer. Lars selected his building materials with a knowledge that baffled his neighbors. He ignored the stands of straight, live pine and instead sought out the deadfall, trees that had been felled by wind or age, lying on the forest floor. To Beecher Pinkston, this was madness. Deadfall was good for little more than firewood. But Lars was looking for something specific, white pine that had been down for at least 1 full season. This, he knew, was a Värmland builder's secret. The wood, while losing some of its green flexibility, had also lost most of its moisture. It was lighter, more stable, and less prone to shrinking and checking after construction. It was pre-seasoned by nature. He and Sven felled no living trees. They became scavengers, harvesting 60 logs, each about 10 inches in diameter. They dragged them back to their building site with a borrowed ox, a slow, laborious process. Then the real work began. Using a draw knife, they peeled the bark from every log, revealing the clean, pale wood beneath. The pile of logs grew, a stark, bony collection that looked more like a giant's woodpile than the components of a house. The foundation was simple, a rectangle of flat fieldstones set directly on the cleared ground. This was not a house that needed to be anchored. Its geometry made it stable. Then, Lars laid out the first 2 logs. He took his adze, a tool he wielded with the precision of a sculptor, and began to cut the joints. He wasn't using the familiar saddle notch of a conventional cabin. He was cutting a half-lap joint at the peak. He carved away exactly half the thickness of each log's end for about a foot. When the 2 logs were raised and joined at the top, they met flush, creating a strong, interlocking peak. He and Sven raised the first pair, a towering A against the sky. They braced it, then prepared the next. The process was repeated, each A-frame section placed 3 feet from the last. The structure grew, not as a set of walls, but as a series of ribs, like the skeleton of a great beast. At the peak, where the half-lap joints met, Lars drove home his secret weapon, long, hand-forged spikes he had commissioned from the town blacksmith. These pins locked the joint, ensuring the ridge would not slip or separate under load. Beecher Pinkston rode by one afternoon, his horse picking its way around the scattered piles of bark. He reined in, watching as Lars and Sven heaved another log into place. "Hagström," he called out, his voice a mixture of pity and contempt. "I've cruised timber in this county for 15 years. I'm telling you, that wood is punky. The heartwood's got no more integrity than a dried mushroom. You get 4 inches of wet snow on this thing, and it's going to fold in the middle. The ridge will drop right through that sleeping loft you're planning." Lars paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at Pinkston, then at the log he had just set. He nodded slowly. "The snow will not stay," he said, his English spare and deliberate. He then turned back to his work. The conversation for him concluded. Pinkston shook his head and rode off, telling the men back at the cruise office that the Mad Swede was not only building a foolish house but was deaf to good advice as well. The final stage was the most crucial. Between each of the leaning logs, Lars left a gap of about 2 inches. He sent Karen and Sven into the woods to gather bags of sphagnum moss, which they brought back damp and fragrant. Ingrid, meanwhile, rendered pine pitch into a thick black tar over a small fire. Lars took handfuls of the damp moss and packed it tightly into the gaps between the logs, tamping it down with a wooden paddle. He worked from the inside, forcing the moss outward until it formed a dense, springy seal. Then from the outside, Ingrid and the children followed, painting the moss seam with hot tar. The tar saturated the moss, creating a waterproof, airtight yet flexible gasket. It was a technique centuries old, designed to accommodate the natural movement of the wood without cracking. When they were finished, the A-frame stood complete. It was a strange, alien structure on the Wisconsin landscape, a dark, steep-sided pyramid of pine, its tarred seams like black scars against the pale logs. Inside, the space was a single vaulted room smelling of pine and pitch. A sleeping loft was built into the upper third of the triangle, accessible by a simple ladder. To the settlers of Burnett County, it looked primitive, unstable, and profoundly wrong. To Lars Hagström, it looked like home. It looked like survival. The genius of Lars Hagström's design was not in its materials, but in its elegant exploitation of 2 fundamental laws of physics. The first was convective rise. The second was the relationship between angle, friction, and gravity. Heat, in the form of warm air, is less dense than cold air. It rises. In a conventional box-shaped cabin with a flat ceiling, this is a problem. The heat from a stove rises, hits the ceiling, and spreads out into a layer of warm air that is largely useless as the family lives on the floor. The coldest part of the room is the floor, where drafts seep in. The warmest part is the useless space just below the ceiling. To warm the living area, you must heat the entire volume of the room from top to bottom, an incredibly inefficient process. Lars's A-frame turned this problem into a solution. The entire structure acted as a giant insulated chimney. The interior walls sloped steeply inward from the floor all the way to the ridge peak. When Lars lit the small iron stove at the base of the cabin, the warm air it produced did not spread out. It was funneled upward by the sloping walls, following the path of least resistance. This created a powerful, continuous current of warm air flowing directly toward the peak. The sleeping loft, situated in the upper third of the structure, was positioned perfectly in the path of this thermal current. It wasn't just warmed by ambient heat. It was actively bathed in a river of warmth rising from below. Measurements would later show that the air temperature in the loft was consistently 32% warmer than the air at floor level. The family slept in the warmest part of the house, their bodies suspended in the reservoir of heat that the cabin's very shape collected and concentrated. Lars had essentially built a house where the waste heat became the primary heating system for the sleeping quarters. He wasn't heating a box, he was directing a flow. The second principle, snow shed, was even more critical. Beecher Pinkston's prediction of collapse was based on his experience with low-pitched roofs that accumulated massive snow loads. He was right about the danger, but wrong about the premise. He saw a roof. Lars had built a slide. The key was the 38-degree pitch. Extensive experience in the snowy regions of Scandinavia had taught builders like Lars that this angle was a critical threshold. A slope gentler than about 35 degrees allows the coefficient of friction between the snow and the roof surface to overcome the force of gravity. The snow sticks, but at 38 degrees, the equation flips. Gravity begins to win. For a light, powdery snow, this is obvious. It would hardly stick at all. But the real test, as Pinkston noted, was wet, heavy snow. This type of snow can weigh up to 20 pounds per cubic foot. As it accumulates on a roof, its own weight compresses the lower layers, increasing its density and its grip. On a low-pitched roof, this process continues until the load is immense. On Lars's 38-degree A-frame, however, the process was self-limiting. As the wet snow began to accumulate, its weight increased. But as soon as that weight reached a critical point, approximately 14 pounds per square foot, the force of gravity pulling the mass down the slope would overcome the friction holding it in place. The entire sheet of snow would release and slide off in a clean avalanche. The roof would shed its load before the load ever became dangerous. Pinkston saw 60 logs waiting to be crushed. Lars saw 2 steep, smooth slides waiting to be cleared by the pull of the earth. The tarred seams, being slightly raised and slick, acted like miniature runners, further reducing friction and encouraging the slide. The house was designed to shrug off the winter's burden, not to bear it. The winter of 1893 arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a treacherous, creeping cold. It began in late November with what the old-timers called a driftless rain into snow. For 4 days, a warm front stalled over the region, and a miserable, bone-chilling rain fell from a slate-gray sky. The temperature hovered at 35 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. The rain soaked everything. It saturated the ground, dripped from the bare branches of the oaks, and ran in rivulets down the walls of the settlers' cabins, finding every crack in the chinking. Then, on the 5th night, the front passed, and the temperature plummeted. It dropped 10 degrees in an hour, then 20. By morning, the thermometer outside the general store read minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit. The world, which had been wet and pliable, was now locked in a vise of ice. Every surface was coated in a thick, clear glaze, in some places 6 inches deep. Tree branches, heavy with ice, hung low like weeping willows, and the sound of them snapping under the immense weight echoed through the frozen woods like pistol shots. For the families in the conventional cabins, the ordeal was immediate and terrifying. The water-soaked logs of their homes froze solid, the ice in the wood acting as a superconductor, pulling heat out of the interior at an alarming rate. The chinking, saturated and then frozen, cracked and shattered, opening up hundreds of new gaps for the Arctic air to pour in. Inside Jebediah Stone's cabin, the family huddled around their stove, which glowed a dull red. Yet just 10 feet away, a bucket of water for washing had a solid 2-inch cap of ice. They burned through a week's worth of wood in 2 days, the heat seemingly vanishing into the walls. The cold was a palpable thing, a pressure that squeezed the breath from their lungs. In Lars Hagström's A-frame, the story was different. The 4 days of rain had run harmlessly down the steep, tar-sealed slopes. The logs, having been seasoned deadfall, were low in moisture and did not become saturated. When the freeze hit, the exterior of the A-frame was encased in a beautiful, terrible sheath of clear ice. But inside, A small, controlled fire in the stove sent a steady column of warm air rising. Ingrid worked at a small table, her fingers nimble as she mended a tear in Sven's trousers. The air smelled of drying wool and the faint, clean scent of pine. A small kettle simmered on the stove, letting out a gentle puff of steam. Karen sat on a sheepskin rug on the floorboards, not near the fire, but halfway across the room, playing with a set of carved wooden animals. She was in her shirt sleeves. This was the true test, the quiet miracle. Not a roaring fire holding a desperate circle of warmth, but a gentle, pervasive comfort that filled the entire space. On the floor near the wall, a pail of water for the morning had only a thin, transparent skim of ice, easily broken with a finger. Outside, the world was snapping and groaning under a crushing burden of ice. Inside, a child played on the floor in her shirt sleeves. The vindication did not come as a knock on the door. It came, as justice on the frontier often did, as an accidental discovery in the woods. 3 days into the deep freeze, Beecher Pinkston sent one of his best timber cruisers, a young man named Silas Croft, to check on a logging camp that had been set up along a new right-of-way for the Sioux Line Railroad. Silas walked through a world of glass. Every twig and pine needle was encased in ice, sparkling with a cold, cruel beauty. The going was treacherous. When he reached the site of the logging camp, his breath caught in his throat. The 3 large canvas tents that had housed the crew were gone. In their place were 3 mangled heaps of canvas and splintered wood. The weight of the glaze ice had been too much. The ridge poles had snapped, and the heavy, ice-saturated canvas had collapsed, crushing everything inside. It was a scene of total destruction. Had the crew not been in town for supplies, they would have been trapped. Shaken, Silas continued his survey, pacing the line up to the next bench. As he cleared a stand of ice-laden birch, he stopped dead. There, on the ridge, stood Hagström's A-frame. It was a vision of impossible defiance. The landscape around it was a uniform, glittering white, every surface bowed or broken under the weight of the ice. But the A-frame was dark and clean. The steep 38-degree pitch had done its work. The rain had run off, and as the ice had tried to form, its own weight had caused it to shear away and slide down the smooth, tarred logs. The roof was bare. It stood there, a sharp, dark wedge of pine in a world of crystal, having shrugged off the burden that had crushed the logging camp below. Silas stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew. He walked closer. He reached out a gloved hand, expecting to touch a surface brittle and slick with ice. Instead, his fingers met dry, solid timber. It was cold, yes, but it was just wood. He ran his hand along the black, tarred seam. It was perfect, uncracked. He abandoned the rest of his survey and headed back to the crew's office. He found Pinkston poring over a map. "The camp on the Sioux Line trace is gone," Silas said, his voice flat. Tents collapsed. The ice load. Pinkston looked up, his face grim. "Damnation. Anyone hurt?" "No, they were in town, but Beecher, there's something else. The Swede's cabin, the A-frame." "What about it?" Pinkston asked, expecting a report of its collapse. "It's standing," Silas said. "It's clean. There's no ice on it. None at all. It just slid off." Pinkston said nothing. He put on his heavy coat and walked out of the office. He didn't saddle his horse. He walked the 2 miles to Hagström's ridge, the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground the only sound. When he saw it, he understood. The clean, dark lines of the structure against the glittering white devastation of the forest were an argument more powerful than any words. It wasn't just standing, it was serene. It was untouched. He didn't approach the door. He walked the perimeter, his experienced eyes taking in every detail: the perfect seams, the dry wood, the pile of shed ice at the base of the walls. He saw the faint plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe, a calm, steady breath, not the frantic plume of a stove being desperately fed. He finally stopped and stared at the sharp peak, the half-lapped joint he had condemned. It was holding not just the weight of the logs, but the weight of a truth he had refused to see. He had looked at the structure and seen weakness. He had been wrong. Lars emerged from the cabin carrying an empty wood bucket. He saw Pinkston and stopped, waiting. The foreman, the most respected timberman in the county, looked from the cabin to Lars, his face a mixture of awe and humility. "Hagström," Pinkston said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was wrong." He gestured with a mittened hand at the elegant, powerful shape of the building. "You didn't build a cabin," he said, the words forming a new and startling thought in his own mind. "You built a wedge to split the winter." The ultimate proof of Lars's success was not just a warm house, but the continuation of life's small, vital processes. In every other cabin in Burnett County that January, things that were meant to be soft were frozen hard. A pot of soured milk for making cheese would freeze into a solid, useless block that had to be thawed by the stove, ruining the texture. One afternoon, Ingrid invited Jebediah Stone's wife, Martha, inside. Martha was weary, her face etched with the strain of their family's struggle against the cold. The warmth of the A-frame hit her like a physical blow. She saw Karen playing on the floor. She smelled the impossible, glorious scent of rye bread baking. Then Ingrid showed her the proof. Hanging from a wooden peg high in the sleeping loft, where the river of warm air flowed strongest, was a small muslin bag. Ingrid took it down and opened it. Inside was soured cream cheese, not frozen, but perfectly cured into a firm, dry crumble, ready to be eaten. It was a simple domestic fact, but in the context of that winter, it was a profound declaration of victory. The cabin was not just a shelter from the cold, it was a space where the delicate chemistry of life could proceed, uninterrupted. Martha stared at the cheese, then at the comfortable warmth of the room, and her eyes filled with tears. News of the clean-roofed A-frame and the cheese that wouldn't freeze spread faster than any winter wildfire. The mockery turned to curiosity, then to respect. The story of the collapsed logging tents became a local legend. The following spring, a foreman from a Wisconsin pinery lumber camp on the Yellow River came to see Lars. He was a practical man tasked with building better bunkhouses for his crews. He spent an hour with Lars, sketching in his notebook, asking quiet questions. Lars explained the half-lap joint, the 38-degree pitch, the moss and tar seam. The foreman listened, nodding. A week later, Beecher Pinkston was reviewing the foreman's cruise book. Tucked in the back, on a blank page, was a detailed hand-drawn diagram of Lars Hagström's A-frame design, complete with dimensions and notes on the deadfall pine. Pinkston looked at the drawing for a long time, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the highest form of frontier praise, not an apology, but an adoption. By the autumn of 1894, 6 new bunkhouses, steep-roofed and solid, stood along the Yellow River, built not from expensive live timber, but from scavenged deadfall. They were warmer, cheaper, and safer than any that had come before. The idea, born of ancient Swedish wisdom and forged in a brutal Wisconsin winter, had begun its journey. The principles that made Lars Hagström's A-frame so effective were not new, but their application on the American frontier was revolutionary. Today we see echoes of his design in modern architecture. The A-frame became a symbol of rustic, affordable vacation homes in the mid-20th century, celebrated for its simple construction and efficient use of materials. But its core virtues are timeless. The focus on a small footprint, the use of passive thermal dynamics to channel heat, the steep roof designed to shed environmental loads, These are all concepts central to modern green building and sustainable design. Architects today speak of the stack effect to describe the natural convection that Lars harnessed instinctively. They use advanced materials to create a building envelope that is airtight and well insulated, just as Lars did with his humble moss and tar. He had, with the tools and knowledge of his ancestors, anticipated by a century the principles that now guide our most advanced architectural thinking. There is a lesson in the story of Lars Hagström that goes beyond the cleverness of his design. It's a lesson about our relationship with the natural world. The conventional cabins of his neighbors were built in opposition to the winter. They were fortresses, squared-off boxes of brute force, attempting to hold the cold at bay. They were a statement of defiance. But defiance is exhausting, and in the face of nature's overwhelming power, it is often futile. Lars did not build a fortress. His approach was one of accommodation, not confrontation. He looked at the forces of winter, the weight of snow, the physics of cold, the tendency of heat to rise, and he did not fight them. He yielded to them. He channeled them. He built a structure whose very shape agreed with gravity, letting the snow slide harmlessly away. He built a structure whose interior was designed to cooperate with the laws of thermodynamics, guiding the warmth to where it was needed most. The other settlers laid their logs flat against the ground, creating a wall for the cold to press against. Lars stood his logs up and leaned them against each other, creating a form that let the cold slide past on both sides, while cradling the warmth within. He didn't conquer the winter. He simply made a place where the winter was no longer the enemy. It's a profound shift in thinking, from resistance to resilience, from a battle against nature to a partnership with its fundamental laws. It was a wisdom born not in a laboratory, but in the long, cold nights of a Värmland forest, a wisdom that proved its worth one January day on a frozen ridge in Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found the principles of Lars Hagström's design as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories of historical ingenuity. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other examples of working with nature instead of against it can you think of in building or design? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone seeking to apply these or other historical building methods today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.